Jesus was a false teacher. Well, not really, but according to the standards that many well-meaning Christians and well-meaning Christian leaders use today to categorize somebody as a false teacher, if Jesus were living and teaching among us today, here are 3 reasons why many Christians and many Christian leaders would have no choice but to label Jesus as a false teacher. And you're going to want to stick around to the end of this video because I believe that reason number 3 is the most convincing. Reason number 1, Jesus regularly associated with known false teachers. You have some Christians and Christian leaders alike who will suggest that if you see somebody who is a Christian leader or a Christian teacher or a Bible teacher or a Christian figure, and they are somehow associating or being seen around or in the same camp or on the same stage as somebody that we would put in the category of a false teacher, then therefore that person must also be guilty by association of being a false teacher. Well, if we use that standard, then we would also have to label Jesus as a false teacher, and let me prove it to you. In Luke chapter 7, it says this: one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now you may say, wait a second, Alan, who are these Pharisees? These Pharisees weren't just some run-of-the-mill teachers that were kind of off here and there. No, these were known false teachers of the day. At least Jesus categorized them as that because they denied the deity and the divinity of Jesus Christ. They also taught a false gospel of salvation by works and not just by faith. So these are the people that Jesus is hanging out with. He is breaking bread with, which, by the way, in that culture was a symbol and a sign of intimate fellowship. Well, you may say, well, you know what? That was just one time, no big deal. Let's keep going because in Luke chapter 11, it says this: while Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. But the one in Luke chapter 14 is probably the most interesting and would be the most troubling if we saw this happening today. And it says this: one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. Now, Jesus isn't just hanging out with a false teacher. He is hanging out with one of the chief false teachers. He's hanging out with the leader of the group of false teachers. So if you can imagine today, if you saw one of your reputable Bible teachers today having fellowship or having dinner at the house of somebody who was a known false teacher, you didn't have any context for what they were talking about. You didn't know if that person was trying to correct their theology or trying to get them to understand the ways of righteousness any better. You just saw a screenshot, a snapshot. You saw something on social media or whatnot, and you saw this reputable Bible teacher, or maybe if Jesus was alive today, and you saw Jesus hanging out at the house of somebody who you have already labeled as a false teacher without any context of what was going on, the conversations they had or whatnot, you would be left with no choice, more than likely, to label Jesus as a false teacher. Now remember, reason number 3 is the most convincing, but before we get to that, reason number 2 is the fact that not only was Jesus known for hanging out with known false teachers, but Jesus was also known for being associated with sinful people. Could you imagine if cell phones were in back then the way they are now, and people were snapping pictures all over the place and putting them on social media? If you saw Jesus today without having the luxury of looking back into the New Testament and knowing what Jesus was all about and who he was and what he did, but you just saw Jesus hanging out with some sinful people, would you be tempted to label Jesus also as a false teacher? Notice it says this in Luke 15, tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. Now I want you to notice here that it's not the regular religious people that are criticizing Jesus for hanging out with sinful people. No, it is the self-righteous the brightest theological minds, the most religious people of the day, and they are the ones that are categorizing Jesus as being someone other than who he was because he was associated, he was hanging out, spending time with people who were sinful. Let's take another snapshot of Jesus' life. In John chapter 4, we see Jesus hanging out with a woman who had 4 strikes against her. Number one, she was a woman, and in those days, a religious man should have no private fellowship whatsoever with a woman. But not only was she a woman, she was also a very sinful woman, had been married 5 times, and the guy that she was with now was not her own husband. So number 3 strike against her, that she was shacking up. And then number 4, she was a Samaritan. So can you imagine for just a second if you had a whole bunch of people that didn't understand the context of what Jesus was trying to do with this woman, teaching her the ways of righteousness, and they just saw Jesus spending extended time with a very, very sinful woman. They were around with their cell phones, taking pictures, snapping it, putting it on social media platforms, and this is the only context that we had. We would have no choice left but to label Jesus as a false teacher. But it gets better, because in Luke chapter 5, it says this: Levi gave a large dinner at his home for Jesus. Everybody was there, taxmen and other disreputable characters as guests at the house. Now, I love this one because here we now see Jesus not just hanging out with sinful people. Jesus is at a house party. You don't know what was going on at that house party. I'm sure there was a lot of drinking. People like Jay-Z, Beyonce, Kim Kardashian, Nicki Minaj, all these people that most people would kind of put in the category of worldly and sinful. And Jesus is up there in the house, at the house party, hanging out with these people, being seen with these people. Can you imagine for just a moment if Jesus was at this party today and people had their phones and they were taking pictures of Jesus sitting next to all of these sinful people and posting them all on social media? We would have to suggest that Jesus was a false teacher. What would you say today if you saw your favorite Bible teacher, the one that you respect the most, and he is hanging out at a house party that was hosted by a very sinful person, and the friends that he invited were also sinful people, and that person that you're looking up to knew that these people were sinful. They knew that there was going to be some drinking going on. They knew that there was going to be some drugs going on, and you saw that person at a party? Would you also start to bring their character into question and may be tempted to label them as a false teacher? Well, my friends, that's exactly what the religious people of that day did to Jesus, because in the next verse it says, the Pharisees and their religious scholars came to his disciples greatly offended. What is he doing, eating and drinking with crooks and sinners? But my friend, here is the bigger question that I want to challenge you. When is the last time you have been around sinful people? Because you see, it's easy for us to say, I want to be a follower of Jesus. I want to be a Christian, right? I want to live like Christ. And we are stuck in our Christian homes, in our Christian small groups, in our Christian churches, hanging out with our Christian friends, and we have very, very little impact or even any sort of association or even being around in proximity with people who are sinful people, therefore limiting and minimizing the impact that we can make on this world to strictly only Christians. And yet we pass judgment on other maybe Christian leaders who are seen in the media or in public or on social media for that matter, being associated with other people who might just be sinful. Last I checked, Jesus said it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it is the sick. But here is the third and final reason why I believe many well-meaning Christians and Christian leaders alike would have no choice but to also label Jesus as a false teacher if Jesus were living and teaching among us today. And that is the fact that Jesus was often misunderstood and labeled as a false teacher based on what he said. Listen, if we just took for face value what Jesus said without having the context, without having the luxury of looking back in the New Testament to get understanding about what he actually meant by what he said and getting clarity, without having the luxury of 2,000 years of scholarship, of people studying the scriptures and the sayings of Jesus Christ, if we just took for face value some of the things that Jesus said in that day, my friend, we would have to label him as a false teacher. Let me give you a few. In Luke 14, it says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Wait a second, Jesus. Doesn't the Bible say that I have to honor my father and mother? And now you're coming along totally contradicting one of the 10 commandments and telling me that I should hate my mother and my father. You, Jesus, are a false teacher. But then it gets better. In John 6, it says, anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him. Now, wait. Are you telling me, Jesus, that I have to eat somebody's physical body and I have to drink their nasty blood? And if I don't do that, that I am not going to be saved? Jesus, this is cray-cray. This is heretical. You are a false teacher. But here's another one in Matthew chapter 5. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And then later on, he says, hey, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. Now, wait a second, Jesus. Are you now teaching self-mutilation? Are you literally teaching me to hurt myself just because I'm struggling with sin? So what's the point that I'm trying to make here? We need to be more careful about not just looking at isolated phrases about what somebody says without getting further clarity about what they mean, because I've just proven to you that there is often a disconnect between what somebody says and what they mean. But far too often what we do is that we listen to a soundbite. We look at something that's been posted on social media. We look at an article, or we look at a review video or reaction video or some sort of video by one of our favorite pastors or YouTube personalities who have basically decided that this person is true and this person is false without having the clarity to be able to discern between, okay, this is what I read, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, and it sounds a little bit different from what it should sound like, but let me do my due diligence to make sure I get the clarity between what this person said and what they actually mean, because there could very well be a disconnect. Perfect example, you could take the soundbite at the beginning of this video where I said, Jesus was a false teacher. Jesus was a false teacher. Jesus was a false teacher. And if you took that soundbite and you took the picture from this thumbnail and you posted all over social media, you could convince a whole bunch of people that I am also a false teacher as well without listening to the whole video and getting clarity between what was said and what I was trying to convey in this video. And what's most interesting is that the main people that were criticizing Jesus were the greatest, brightest theological minds of his day, who believed that they had a 100% monopoly on the truth. And my friend, unfortunately, that is how it is today. So many people think they know everything, and many of us are not willing to walk in humility to admit that maybe, just maybe, somebody out there who may see things just a little differently than I do. Maybe, just maybe, I don't know everything about everything, and I don't have a full monopoly on every single theological detail or every single some sort of controversial issue that may come up in the body of Christ. So are some of the things that some people say false? Absolutely they are. And my friend, if you do your diligence and you get clarity in terms of what that person was actually trying to say and what they meant, and you come to the conclusion that that is false, then my friend, I will join with you and say that is heretical. That is not sound doctrine. That is unorthodox. And you don't need to give credence to that, because that is clearly a false teaching. But all I'm going to say is that before you go out there trying to label somebody as a false teacher, do your due diligence to make sure you bridge the gap between what they said and what they actually meant, because they very well could be a disconnect. So was Jesus a false teacher? Absolutely not. We know that he wasn't. But I would suggest today that if we use the standards by many well-meaning Christians and well-meaning Christian leaders today, and we say that, you know what, Jesus was associating on a regular basis with false teachers. Jesus was also going to house parties and hanging out with people who were very, very sinful. And finally, Jesus said some things that on the surface, taking for face value, We're completely off base and sound very heretical. If we just used those standards, then my friend, we would have no choice but to also lump Jesus into a category of people that we would come to know as false teachers. We have the luxury, my friend, of looking back and knowing who Jesus was, what he was about, and what he did on our behalf. And as a result, we give Jesus freedom in the Gospels to do these three things. We may or may not always have that luxury of getting into somebody's heart and understanding why they are spending time with false teachers, or why they were seen at somebody's house, or why they were shown on social media at a party, or having taken a picture with somebody that we would consider being very sinful. And we also don't always have the luxury of discerning the difference between what they said and what they actually meant by what they said. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. If you found this video helpful in any way, feel free to share it with a friend. Also, if you haven't done so already, I would love it if you would subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.